So of course we've seen this one, we've talked about all of that. Putting the mark of the beast there in the middle. We as domesticated animals, if you're not aware of it, the definition and law of a human being is a monster. We're considered monsters by the elite, or domesticated animals or beasts. Cattle, which translates to chattel, which translates to capital. Here's another place where you can see the two pillars and the Ark of Anu. Don't know if you remember how that evolved, but city, which was actually, it started life in 1791 as the first bank of the United States, and then when the charter was discontinued in 1811, which led to the War of 1812, it became City National and evolved eventually to become this. They bought Travelers Insurance. Their logo was the red umbrella, and they translated the red umbrella to the red Ark of Anu over the two pillars with the cross in the middle. And here's another representation of life being caught and controlled in between the two pillars. The lights are a little strong, but y'all can see that, I think. You just got that look like, shit, I'm stuck. Everybody familiar with the flag of the British East Indies Company? So basically, the United States flag, the upper left quadrant is the position of the sovereign on a flag. So you have the cross of St. George, or the Templar cross, or the cross of Switzerland as the neutral zone of the banking system that the Templars laid out in the 11 and 1200s. Overlaying the other cross, actually that cross hatching, okay, if you lay out a map of the globe, sort of in a flat map, and you put the center of that diagonal cross right on Giza, Egypt, the Giza plateau, and you draw two lines into the land masses, basically that's what you get. So that's essentially the overlay of the vertical horizontal cross, which represents the banking system, over the landmass of the physical planet. And so when you put the 13 stars in there for the original flag of the United States, this is the British East Indies flag, which is the commercial joint stock company from the Crown and the corporation known as the city, or the city known as the corporation. There's only one corporation on the planet, and it's called the city, or it's called the corporation. It's the City of London, the 1 square mile that's in London, England. And so it's a contract between the 13 states, which were, previous to 1787, essentially sovereign, free and independent states. But as we were just talking about, as I mentioned earlier, my progression through the 5 attempts of participating in creating a jurisdiction, for those of you not familiar with it, 5 years ago, there was a collective attempt to supposedly reseat the Republic of the United States of America. We call it RUSA. And it was based on the Constitution and so forth, but the Constitution is another bait and switch. And it's all basically contained in the preamble. We, the people of the United States, who are one contracting party, establish and ordain this Constitution to create a federal entity called the United States of America. But in the Articles of Confederacy, which was written in 1777 and ratified by 1781, right around the time the so-called Revolutionary War was ending, in the Articles, the first article says, the style of this confederacy shall be, quote, capital T, the United States of America, unquote. So the formal name of the Confederacy as a republic of 13 free and independent states per the Declaration of 1776 was capital T, USA, TUSA. So then we go to 1783, the Treaty of Peace, or the Treaty of Paris, that supposedly was a treaty of peace ending the Revolutionary War, was really a contract with the City of London and the United States. The articles established that the collective acts of the United States, of the Confederacy, would be enacted, authorized to enact by a body called the United States in Congress assembled. So that was 1781. 1783, the Treaty of Paris starts by saying George III, King George III, King of England, King of France, and the Prince Elector and Arch Treasurer of small t, the United States of America. Okay, so we have to go back to the two pillars established by Otto the Great and the Pope or the Vatican in 962, which is a continuation of Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Empire and the Carolingian lineage, which became the Prince Electors through Otto the Great. And then you have that split, as I said, along a 33-degree parallel between South and North Carolina, essentially splitting it to play both sides against the middle. So Otto the Great and his descendancy were the Prince Electors as the crown or the line of the king. So when George III in the Treaty of Paris is defined as the Prince Elector, they're saying that that individual holding the position of monarch, sitting on that throne, is the Prince Elector. He's part of the Germanic lineage of the line of the king that will control all the land under the testamentary trust of the Unum Sanctum of 1302 to meet, as I said, at the end of time and merge the two. So the Holy Roman Empire, as we know, was started in 325 AD by Constantine, and by 962 was defined as having the position of emperor being the Prince Elector and the Arch Treasurer, the treasurer being he who controls the purse strings, he who is capable of bonding the flesh and the bodies in commerce through the office of the exchequer, which is the treasury of the city or the corporation. Interestingly, do you know what the definition of the word hell in a law dictionary is? H-E-L-L. It's defined in a law dictionary as the chamber under the office of the exchequer where the debtors are held. Okay, so in 1783, the United States of America is being defined as under the control of the Prince Elector and the Arch Treasurer of the Holy Roman, and this is exactly the wording in that treaty. The Prince Elector and Arch Treasurer of the Holy Roman Empire, etc. There's a lot behind that word, etc. And the United States of America. So the United States of America, as birthed in 1781, distinguished from capital T, the United States of America, birthed in 1781 as the Confederacy and the free and independent states, to be represented in unity, so to speak, by United States and Congress assembled. 4 years later is going to enter a contract. We, the people of the United States, establish and ordain this Constitution for the United States of America. That's a contract between two high contracting parties, establishing the relationship between the 13 states in the upper left quadrant and the 13 red and white stripes representing the 13 bloodlines and so forth and this city of London. In between that, in 1784 was the United States and Congress assembled passed something called the Northwest Ordinance. Most of us think of the Northwest Ordinance as being passed on July 12, 1787, but there were two. One was 1784 that established a Northwest territory, which was basically the Ohio Valley, possibly with Columbus being in the center of it, now that you mention that, and surrounding lands. And then in 1785, you have something called the Land Ordinance of 1785 that established the rectilinear mapping of townships and ranges and sections, 36 sections per township, and the relationship between that land construction and land patents to be issued by, when the contract of 1787 is complete, the United States of America, controlling the land through the patents. The bottom line is that the only one who can be considered an elector with standing status and capacity is one who is standing on the land. Everyone else is lifted off the land into a containment field or containment structure called the civitas. The civil body, or the civitas in Latin and Roman civil law, is basically the mass population. They do not have standing as substantive beings. They are only civil, basically domesticated animals. They're going to be put into the civil body, given civil rights, and all the rest of it. So that's a mechanism or a counter distinction between who is on the land under the prince elector, or the crown, the king that controls the land, and the mass that's lifted off the land and put into the containment field of the civil body. So after 1785, excuse me, and the ordinance of 1785, you have the second Northwest Ordinance issued 2 months before the Constitution. Well, isn't that a coincidence? Okay. If you read the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it basically says the purpose of it is to form a temporary government to be controlled under the articles or the clauses of the Northwest Ordinance, and to be established in a district, which is probably Columbus, Ohio. Somehow I think that's a good possibility now that you mentioned it earlier. And to have the capacity to separate itself into a second district for the management of the states that can come in under equal footing with all the nice bells and whistles of, you know, equality, equal footing, due process of law, and all the rest of what you would read in the Northwest Ordinance, which I also got into and used in my documents earlier on, was, you know, in my progression, thinking that was the end-all be-all, until I was provided the insight to wake up and understand what was really going on there. Because the first district was controlling that territory that would become states that would come in on equal footing with the original 13 states. Essentially what you have is a structure of a district, and the whole world system is controlled as districts, and states that will come in essentially as corporations as part of that district, able to separate itself and establish a second district, which becomes the District of Columbia, and then the territorial jurisdiction of that. 2 months later, you have the definition of that district and the Constitution that's going to establish the structure of the federal government. Now, one of the keys in there is Article 6, which says, henceforward, all debts and engagements previously liable against the United States or the Confederacy shall be liable against the liabilities carried over by the United States of America. What that really established was the United States of America, which again is under the George III as the Prince Elector and the Arch Treasurer, is the United States of America became a constitutor. Anybody here not know what that word means? Okay. Constitutor is defined, pardon?
Is it like a surety?
Yeah, basically it's defined as one who takes on the obligation of another. Okay. So the federal district, District of Columbia, commercial zone and all the rest of it, started life as a bankrupt because it became the constitutor for the debts previously held by the free and independent states that went to war and borrowed a bunch of money from the French, who were controlled by the king, who was known as George III. So on the one hand, he's lending money to his so-called rebelling colonialists, and he's fighting them here with Rothschild agents called Hessian mercenaries, and lending money and fighting here. And then when it's all done, he has 3 esquires, which an esquire minimally must be a captain, meaning a captain of a ship. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay signing this treaty of peace. So agents of the crown signing with the crown, creating this construct called the United States of America that the United States and Congress assembled 4 years later is going to enter a contract and establish through the constitutor relationship that the United States will be a bankrupt by taking all previous debts and engagements previously against the free and independent states, the colonies, and the original charter of essentially the Virginia Company, which is a secondary offshoot of the British East Indies Company, that in the 1680s or 1680, several acts were passed that gave the Virginia Company authority to do 5 things: to engage in war, to settle war with treaties, or not necessarily settle war, but to enter into treaties, international treaties, to set up administrative courts, to coin money, and to hold land. Okay, the 5 essential elements of what the federal government was given by the Constitution, which entered its life as a constitutor to take the debt that the king on the one hand gave to fight the war against the king on the other hand. So the Constitution and the concept of the Republic and reseeding the Republic and doing what we tried to do 3 years ago was another bait and switch. And that's a whole other story, and we won't go into it further. The point being is why, the reason I brought it up is to give you what I just gave you. How does that all sit with you? Heavy?
No surprises anymore.
No. No surprises, but revelations. Okay. Wakening up to exactly how the world system has been constructed, becoming aware of it, and as I said, embodying or integrating it so that in that awareness we can move forward and do what we're here to do, which is to regain our status, standing, and capacity, which is what we're really here to discuss today. So consider all that prefatory. So when we left off talking about the Sestake Act, there are Sestakes which you could translate as living men. Okay, what is a living man? One who is recognized within the testamentary trust structure and all the rest of it as those who have been elevated outside of that relationship of the polarized system that are going to be used as chattel capital to create the monetized, suretized debt as currency. A man in that context, and of course, really at that time it did not include women who were considered chattel property, But a man only had standing if he held an estate and he had a relationship with the land. And the relationship with the land was something called an oath of fealty, because only the crown could have land or grant land through a royal grant. Royal as in real, R-E-A-L. So all of you who have what you think of as real estate are really only tenants on the royal estate. You're just serfs on the royal estate when you are in real estate, royal estate. So only through a grant of a royal land grant and a reciprocal relationship contractually known as an oath of fealty, or a bonding of oneself in loyalty or allegiance to a liege lord, can one become a landlord. But you are still a vassal within the hierarchical feudal system of lord and vassal, becoming a lord with lesser vassals. The ultimate lord in that whole construct now is someone called the Lord Mayor of the city, which is who controls the city of London. And when the monarch or the queen, or if it's a king of the United Kingdom, wishes to enter the city of London, he or she must ask permission of the Lord Mayor. So that tells you who is the Lord and who is the vassal. So when we have something in the testament, which by the way, mente means the mind, so we have testicles and mind combined in a testament. What? In the New Testament, we have a central pillar, if you will, called the Lord's Prayer, okay, which on the exoteric level appears to be something related to the man called Jesus. But in fact, it's another commercial construct. It's another commercial contract. The Lord referred to as the Lord Mayor of the City of London. So when it says, our Father, our Papa, our Pope, who art in heaven, which is the Vatican, because there is, until the other guy shows up, he's the vicar of Christ, so he gets to be the Father in heaven. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be the name, etc. Thy kingdom come through thy crown, controlled by the Lord Mayor, who's controlling the crown, who's controlling all the land of all the planet through the testamentary trust that claimed all the land, etc., etc. Providing for a remedy in commerce, putting all of the flesh into the realm of commerce, as we discussed earlier. Forgive us our debts and trespasses as we forgive those of others. That's a commercial construct. I'm sure some of you know that already. But that so-called Lord's Prayer is nothing more than defining a commercial construct, which the Old Testament and the New Testament does at different layers. Starting off with the so-called fall was the eating of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, what is the knowledge of good and evil? It's taking the mind and splitting it into a polarity, good and evil. So the collapse of our unified beingness into polarity is simply biting the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. But at the end of the Bible, and then, well, let's not get to the end yet, now you have the Isis-Osiris construction of John the Baptist being beheaded, and then he's the precursor to the Christ, who then will lead you through the church into heaven. But if you replace the word God in the Bible with the word church, and you replace the word Jesus with the word Son, now you have the Son, or Ra, that whole construction we talked earlier, being the one that people are going to pledge allegiance to in order to be led into the body of the church, or the corpus, the corporation, holding all the flesh to harvest your life force and all your substance of creating physical reality and value and wealth on the planet, until you are discarded and you discard your body, and then your soul is harvested. But at the same time, Jesus walked on water. He rose above the polarity of commerce, the battlefield of commerce, and they're saying to you, you can leave that field of battle, rise above that water of commerce, and in the end, walk into the book of life. Because everything in commerce and everything in the civil body is dead. They're all fictions. Corporations are fictions. Your franchise with all capital letters as your name is a fiction, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the hooks that we bought into in the process of going into commerce is something called a secured party process. And we would, and I started going into that myself in 1999, 2000, and all the way through until basically 2-3 years ago. And what would we do? We would put the upper lowercase name as the secured party and the all capital letter name as the debtor. And eventually the secretaries of state that control the records in the registry of commerce have now been instructed to consider anybody trying to do that as being a paper terrorist or a domestic terrorist, because you're causing harm in the public. You're doing battle as an enemy combatant when you do all of that, and now the hammer's going to come down, okay? Because everything in commerce is a fiction. Anything and everything considered a fiction is what? It's a fantasy, it's an illusion, it doesn't exist, it's dead. That's all the realm of the dead. That's why in, I believe, the book of Matthew, and perhaps other places, there's a phrase which says, let the dead tend to the dead. Okay, which is telling you that if you play in the realm of the dead, you're going to be tended to by the dead. Those agents, officers, and so forth who are given limited liability by being bonded to act through a person or persona, which in Greek theater, a persona was, they would have a mask for the different characters that they played, and there was a little megaphone, because they didn't have electronics, they would enhance the sound, and that was called a persona, through sound, sona as in sonar. So a person, personality, or persona is an artificial construct or a mask or a fiction that you project your sound, your essence through, and it's a fiction. So that's why the legal term person is and always has been and always will be and can be nothing else than describing an artificial construct. So when we put our upper lowercase name as a secured party in that relationship, we were simply putting one fiction in relationship to another, and they control all the fictions. The dead shall tend to the dead. Simple. So it's another bait and switch, another hook. Yes, sir, pick up the microphone.
Okay, so Ken, if we've done A for V, set off bonds, etc., then have we gone to war with them?
Well, we never left war, okay? I'll get back to that in a minute, but the answer is yes. We have never left the field of battle, and as I said earlier, for as long as we're at war, they control the rules. They are Martians. They are martial authorities and power.
So is there a way to undo that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's called correcting your status, which we will get to. Okay. But yeah, we're all familiar, I'm sure, with the Trading with the Enemy Act. In 1917, it defined the enemy excluding a U.S. person or a U.S. citizen. Post-1933 and the declaration of bankruptcy and the reconstructing of banking, securities, the Securities Act, the Securities Exchange Act, and so forth, it defined the U.S. person as an enemy of the state. This goes back to a treaty in 1899. Remember, the Virginia Company, which became the United States of America, which became United States, Inc. in the District of Columbia in 1871, has the authority to enter into treaties. So in 1899, through The Hague, a treaty was entered into that established the nature and definition of a belligerent. Okay, and from that point forward, all the way until now, you have the definition underwriting a belligerent, a combatant, a terrorist, an insurgent, all the rest of it. Now, the bankruptcy in 1933 established public policy and public funds to be devised through public policy. And going back to, and then the amendment of the Trading with the Enemy Act establishing the U.S. person as an enemy of the estate. So therefore, if you are an enemy, you're under martial rule, martial law, you are a belligerent, you are a combatant, and progressively and eventually we become paper terrorists, domestic terrorists. Domestic within the domestic zone, because the federal, the United States of America, the United States Inc., the city, the crown, is foreign to the national soil that we want to be standing on. We are a conquered nation, right? Obviously, most of you or all of you know that. So we're an enemy, we're a conquered enemy, and therefore we're a belligerent when we engage with anything that disrupts public policy under bankruptcy rules, which is defined in something called the Administrative Procedures Act, or acts, because all the states, the corporate states in 33 through 35 passed Administrative Procedures Acts that moved everything under the executive to administer and create administrative offices for the ongoing administration of the bankrupt debtor in possession known as the United States. And everything that's created within and as or a subdivision of that United States bankrupt is also a bankrupt. So when you operate with paper, commercial paper, even if you're doing proper commercial process, acceptance, return for value, etc., you're still dealing with their paper and their franchise. You're an enemy, you have no standing because a bankrupt has no standing. If you have no standing, you cannot state a claim. You can't hold a claim substantively of land, and therefore you have no law. So all these things that we've done, and I've done, for example, common law courts of record and trying to convert their civil commercial courts into courts of record, can't do it because I'm still bonded as the surety and holding the liability and accepting the benefit of the franchise, civil rights, the franchise and the benefit of using their private paper, their law merchant paper to operate my franchise, my vessel in commerce. I'm lost at sea. I abandoned my estate and therefore I have no standing to do anything other than maintain public policy. And if I do anything else than that, I'm causing an act of war and I can be held liable for it. Okay, I'm causing harm to the public. So for those of you who are in Pantera and doing Gemstone in the status correction course, you'll notice the use of a phrase, neutral in the public, non-belligerent, non-combatant. Because that's what we want to be, so that we remove ourselves and we put ourselves under an international flag of peace and we maintain neutrality. And anything that you do in the public that causes harm is belligerency. It's an act of war. And the most serious issue is the most serious issue is the court jester coming down the stairs to move the eraser. 4 hours into it and you have to Okay, so are you following the track here? So it goes back to 1213, 1215. Now in 1213, King John, another John, fearing for his immortal soul, made a deal with the Pope and contracted over all of his land hereditaments for his heirs and successors forever. Of course, that was negated, but they don't care about that. They act on it otherwise, because the nobility, the landed gentry, came back, and for one, they, in 1215, got John to sign the Magna Carta, which then the Pope at the time, Innocent, was that Innocent? Yeah, I think it was Innocent III, said, no, you can't do that because he gave it all to me 2 years ago. But later they came back and said, no, you don't have the authority to contract away that which we are bonded to with our oaths of fealty unilaterally. And so, but that's okay, the Vatican will act on it as if they're in control of that crown and that land and so forth. And that's another story we can get to later. But the point is, those who had those rights under the Magna Carta are the men of the land, those sestiques who went to sea or went to war on land first and then went to sea and never came back. Those lands as estates that have to be passed on properly, that the Sestique V Act provided for, should a man be presumed lost at sea and dead after 7 years. Only a man who holds land, stands on the land, has standing to state a claim and to hold a claim. So when I talked about earlier about all the knowledge of statutes and codes and court procedure and everything, and going in, representing yourself pro se, or saying, I don't represent myself, I'm standing here, but they're not standing there, we're not standing there. And then the lawyers come back and they say 12B in federal court, and they say demur in state court, failure to state a claim. And then we write all these amended complaints over and over again, and this has so much logic and so much proficiency in the codes and statutes and everything, except we have no standing. We're a bankrupt because we have not removed that surety attachment to that bonded vessel that the portmaster has arrested and holds as a bailment until we become solvent. And unless and until you settle and close the bonded, securitized obligations or liabilities against the estate, you're a bankrupt. Okay? Severing the contracts and changing that relationship to that franchise as the vessel and the underlying estate. Now, when we go back to the City of London and the Exchequer and the what's known as the Four Inns of Court and the Temple Bar and the British Accredited Registry, BAR, registration of all the royal estate, those bar-carrying esquire/captains are captains of a ship that are operating what's called under a letter of marque and reprisal. Anybody not know what a letter of marque and reprisal is? Okay. Well, essentially a letter of marque and reprisal, hang on, I have to do some more commerce. A letter of marque and reprisal is when one sovereign is at war with another sovereign, and there are captains of a ship of one or the other and flying the flag of one or the other. And a letter of marque and reprisal gives the captain of a ship flying the flag of a sovereign the authority, the legal right to capture and board the ship of an enemy combatant or an enemy captain, and board that ship and properly take prize or booty and prize and reprise it back to his his sovereign. Okay, so a letter of marque and reprisal is how to capture booty and prize on land and sea and return it to your sovereign. Now, if you look at the 14th Amendment, it has this very strange little section in it talking about bounty. Anybody remember that in the 14th Amendment? I forget the exact wording, but it basically says, in the middle of talking about citizens born or naturalized in the United States and blah, 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 and by the way, in the last section saying that the debt can never be challenged for its validity. So you have the 14th Amendment U.S. person being bonded irrevocably to perpetual debt that can never be challenged as long as you're there in that domestic zone. Okay? And in between, it talks about bounty hunters will be honored and will be given their appropriate share. That's referring to letters of marque and reprisal, allowing a bar-registered attorney as an esquire, as a captain, to capture the enemy vessel or enemy ship of a combatant sovereign, board that vessel, and bring it into the portmaster to be underwritten and settled by the adjudicator or the settlement or the adjuster for that prize and booty. So that's what's happening when we're walking around with any form of contractual relationship or nexus to the corporate state as a franchise, as a vessel, as an enemy combatant. And anything we have ever done in commerce using that commercial paper, no matter how lofty and how refined our understanding of commerce is, we are causing harm in the public. We are not neutral, therefore we're a belligerent and we're a combatant, and we come under the definition of a domestic paper terrorist. Okay? Yes, sir?
Does that make this a terrorist organization?
No, this is a private meeting of a private society under the protections and immunities of the Court of the Ecclesia of Pantera de Oro, which has been noticed to every significant world body, including the Pope, the Holy See, the Lord Mayor, the Accountant General in the United Kingdom, the Secretary of State, and so forth. So if I forgot to mention, thank you, this is a meeting of private beings within the protections and immunities of the private society known as Pantera, which is part of what we will get to a little later relative to what we have built so far and continue to build, and are inviting you to come on board, if you will, you know, and help continue to build it. Speaking of which, coming on board, what do they tell sailors when they dock onto land and they're given permission to go onto the land? What's it called? It's called shore leave, but it's also called liberty, okay? Which basically means when you're on the sea, you're under the admiralty control of the captain of the ship, the autocratic unilateral control of that absolute authority, for obvious reasons. You know, you can't have two or more authorities saying, go left, go right, here's a big wave coming after you. You know, you have to have one autocratic control of a ship. That's what the essence of admiralty is. When you're not under admiralty, maritime, commercial, civil control, you are given liberty to go on land. Okay, so that's essentially what, if we want liberty, it ain't the Statue of Liberty, that's Isis rising. Okay, with her crown of solar rays, rays as in Real, the royal crown. Okay, we want liberty to be men and women of standing, and this is equal with women, even though in the old construct, women are chattel property, which they still are today within that system. Just because they have rights to vote, voter registration is simply registering yourself to be chattel property to the crown, okay, and to vote for the corporate president of your corporation. So women, if you truly want to have standing, rescind and revoke your voter registration and get off of that ship of state and come onto the land where is the only place you can have liberty. Hang on. You want to throw the microphone down here?
Yeah, Ken, why could not an act of change of status or status correction be construed as perhaps an act of aggression or treason or whatever the heck label they want to put on it?
Perfect question. Because ultimately it's all voluntary. Okay. 14th Amendment, well, the 13th Amendment did away with involuntary servitude called slavery. But it did not do away with voluntary servitude. Okay, so the Expatriation Act, the day before the 14th Amendment, provided for the capacity for a sovereign being to contract into another jurisdiction, to expatriate from one to the other. That's a voluntary acceding to that new jurisdiction. The word jurisdiction, as I defined it earlier, means the word of the law. But juris has a secondary level of definition, which is oath. It's an oath of allegiance to a liege lord. And what did we do as children in the United States? We did a oath of allegiance, pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, which is King George III, Prince Elector, for the republic for which it stands. Something that stands for something is in lieu of. It stands for the republic. So we took an oath of allegiance to the British East India Company and everything I've been describing all day. I think our friend Jester of the court would like to show you something. Okay, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So it's a relationship between voluntarily consenting and contracting to voluntary servitude. Here's Gemstone Man freeing the chains of bondage, saying, I'm free at last, coming off of the ship of state, the citizenship. Oh. Who was that, man? That was Akhenaten. Hold on 1 second. Citizenship, ship of state, we're on that ship. So the answer to your question is simply that we voluntarily contracted. And I'm going to get into all the detail of the estate, the franchise, the trust structure, how that all works, and how we have the capacity because we voluntarily contracted, therefore we can rescind it based on undisclosed material facts, lack of meeting of the minds, et cetera, and because a voluntary contract can be rescinded. Okay, it's actually written in, certainly in the California Code, where I've seen it, I'm sure in all the other states, which by the way, in all the states, and I'm sure in all the corporate nations on the planet, the presumption of death is written in the statutes and codes, providing for basically the Sesta KV Act. Hold on. So that's really the answer to the question. We can voluntarily whatever the right wording is, we can rescind that contract. Okay. Do they like it? No, not at the middle level, but we will get to before the end of the day where it's operating on the macro scale, and it has already been put in place. Hey, you kids in the back row, if you can't behave yourselves, you're going to have a timeout. I'm going to call the principal and have you removed from the class. It's his fault. Okay. So that answers your question. If you need more detail, we'll get into all the detail. But the essence of it is the Expatriation Act, our voluntary consent, and involuntary servitude has been hardwired into the corporate constitution per the 13th Amendment. So if it's voluntary, we can unvolunteer. So to go back to the Sesta KV Act, the fourth section provides for the remedy. And bottom line is, in law, there always must be a remedy, okay? Which is part of the answer to your question as well. There has to be an exit that is provided for. And in the Sesta KV Act, they have to provide for the contingency if a man who had been presumed to be lost at sea and pronounced dead and having his estate passed on to the control of executors, what happens if the man showed up? Well, one, he has to prove his life. He has to prove he is living. Back then, of course, it was some guy got on a ship, a man, meaning a man of standing, a man holding law because everybody else is essentially an indentured servant on the ship. And he went to sea, and he fell off. He got eaten by sharks. Well, he's not going to come back. But he fell off on the islands of Tahiti and spent 10 years with 10 Polynesian wives eating coconut and pineapple and sitting in the sun on the beach. And he decided, this life is not good enough. I need to go back into Middle Ages England and be bound and chained to the dictates of the king and the church. So for some reason, he made his way back. Probably most of them stayed down on the islands, but they had to provide for, and some of them did actually show up later. They got on another ship and they came back. So the act had to provide for what happens if a man comes back. One, he has to prove his life, and he then can claim his estate. And it provided for the ability to, when claiming the estate, take control of the office of the executor, which in law is basically the highest office possible. And you'll notice it's defined as an office. And that has a lot of provenance in terms of the language, the word, and so forth. It is basically a corporation sole, a sole body holding a office and accruing rights and titles and interests to property and otherwise to execute the office and handle what is held within that office. That's essentially the definition of a corporation sole. So all political offices are corporation sole, and so on and so forth. So the office of executor is considered the highest office because everything ultimately is a state law. So the executor office was filled by those appointed by the court when the man was pronounced dead and lost at sea. But if he comes back and proves his life, proves that he's Captain John and so forth, then he is reinstated into life. He removes himself from the annals of the dead and steps back into the living, walking out of the realm of the dead onto the land of the living into the book of life. And so there's two components, proving life and claiming the estate. And in the Cestui Que Act, it says that if that takes place, then all profits and proceeds generated off of the estate from the time of pronouncement of death revert back to the control of the living man. Okay? And that's the bottom line. So when I said earlier that an estate follows us, or we enter into the lineal vertical line of time through the ancestral lineal estate of our genetic code when we are born, what actually happens in their technical occult construction is we are coming in from the waters of our mother through the canal to the birth, docking at the port, to the doctor, who then delivers us into the bonding of the United States person. And from the living birth, they convert it into a certificate. A certificate is a security. It's a bond. There are three things that control the domestic zone. Registration, which means registering something to be part of the royal estate. Regis, as in regal or royal. Certificating, which means bonding the value of the estate. And licensing, giving permission to operate within the domestic zone, within the public, within the civil body, and be able to do something that is normally illegal. And in fact, we don't have to learn 60 or 80 million laws or legal codes to know what's illegal. There are only two things illegal. It's actually very simple. When you boil it down and you discard all this crap that we've been wallowing in for decades and trying to figure out, it boils down to two simple things. Commerce is illegal and usury is illegal. Now, usury on the surface is defined as disproportionate or exorbitant interest. But the root of it is the Latin word usus, U-S-U-S, which basically means use. So the right of use, or what's called in law usufruct, is illegal. Usufruct means the ability to use something that belongs to somebody else as long as you return it in the same condition. And if you don't return it in the same condition, you have to pay for the damage or the lessening of value. So when everything gets pledged in the bankruptcy through the franchises and all the creation of the collateralized bonded surety to the bankrupt debtor in possession, those who are licensed to use something or usufruct are given permission to use it and pay for the right to use it. Okay, that's called usufruct. So your body is under a usufruct relationship to the corporate state because you don't own it, because it's pledged as collateral. That's why ultimately Obamacare is legal within that system. And of course, insurance is a hypothecation, which is a projection of something into the future. Okay, and it's essentially a wager. Okay, hypothecation, insurance. Social Security is what's called a tontine insurance scheme, which basically is defined as the last man standing gets everything. Okay, so you are wagering by accepting wages that you're betting that you're going to outlast the house, but you're not unless you're immortal. Okay, so when you die and abandon the estate, you release the usufruct of their property, and it reverts back to the estate, or the estate, which is a corporate subdivision of the city, the crown, the corporation. So usufruct is illegal, so you must be licensed for it. You must pay your use tax, which is called DMV registration. It's called property tax. It's called licensing, DMV, et cetera, or registering the car, which belongs to them, the royal estate, and so on and so forth. Well, certificate is simply a bond, a certificate that is a negative against the positive value of the estate. So certificates of interest or certificates of title are bonds of debt that are placed on the usufruct property to use that property under license that normally is illegal within the domestic zone. You getting all this? Because the quiz tomorrow is going to be really, really hard. I hope there's about 500 questions on it, and you must get 100%, or I don't want to tell you what happens if you fail. Huh? You are descended into hell, the chamber under the office of the exchequer.
The government then is acting as executive based on tort.
Right, okay. Okay, he brought up executive daison tort. It's all estate. So when we are birthed, as in B-E-R-T-H, the living body of the newborn infant is informed. The mother on the birth certificate acts as an informant. Inform, that's why the government operates in form. We are informed as the corpus of a grantor trust called your all capital letter name, or a cestui trust. A cestui is similar to usufruct, limited beneficial use, in which a beneficiary has limited use when title is vested in another. Title is vested in the franchise called of the United States. So the mother acts as a grantor, vesting or informing the corpus of the living body to be attached as the indentured substance into that grantor trust, cestui trust, franchise. A grantor trust, by definition, is an indentured trust. Remember the definition of an indentured servant? For example, a man is on the dock in England in 1700 England, and 1700s, he wants to come to America. He has no money, so he indentures himself. He informs himself as the corpus or the indenture that bonds his living body as the future indentured servant to pay off the cost of the passage. Okay, so he's an indentured servant for, say, 5 years. That's voluntary servitude. So the mother indentures our living body, our mothers, at birth, informs into a grantor trust, establishing an indenture that's going to bond to the company store the use of that franchise, that usufruct, to be either given limited beneficial use of the cess decay trust and the property attached to it, property that belongs to another, and or the license right to operate in commerce. When we then go get a driver's license, remember in the Constitution, the federal government has the ability, one of the Article 1 powers of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. When we go to get a license to drive and operate a motor vehicle in commerce, we are volunteering to be the registered agent of that corporation, franchise, cess decay trust, and to operate under license the vehicle in commerce. So we voluntarily are going into commerce under the authority and the control of Congress, who has the power to control interstate commerce. And since it's a state or an e-state, and every time we operate in commerce between states, that's interstate commerce. Corporate state, underlying ancestral estate. So the ancestral estate is abandoned. It's not claimed. When the parents die, it vests into the firstborn son or any living sibling who claims it. Well, we never claim it. Most people don't. And at the end of the life, the physical body, the surety, dies, and the death certificate is issued as a collection instrument to capture all of the liabilities created against the franchise during the course of the life. Every certificate, every commercial instrument, every negotiable piece of paper that is created by the authorized representative who signed in between the two pillars to bond his living or her living substance to underwrite as surety to guarantee the liability of all of that pieces of paper. Every certificate that's created. Now when a baby is born and delivered to the doc, the parents, as the contracted guardians under the marriage contract with the state, cannot even take the baby unless a Social Security number is issued and the doctor injects that living body with a hepatitis B vaccination, which generates a certificate of vaccination. It's the first bond of the living body and DNA and cellular molecular structure of our bodies that takes place that adds up somewhere in the neighborhood of 100, 120 vaccinations by, the age of 6, in order to ensure that that body will degrade and enter into the Faster Death Agency, FDA, authority to control the death and dying industry that represents 1/6 of the U.S. Federal Reserve economy. Okay? So now Obamacare was the last wrap-up to irrevocably bond, not irrevocably because it's voluntary, so it can be revoked, but for most cases irrevocably bond the living substance of those bodies to be part of public policy, to create public funds, to continue to create debt, monetized debt, to be held by something called the Bureau of Public Debt. The Bureau of Public Debt holds all the franchises and all the debt created against every franchise. And that is the public debt referred to in the 14th Amendment that can't be challenged because of the U.S. personhood that's been accepted. The Trading with the Enemy Act provided for something called the custodian of alien property. We're foreign to the state, we're enemies of the estate, but when we remove our engagement with the field of battle and we declare peace and we operate only in the realm of the private and we don't go back into the public zone or traverse back to the public and engage with battle or war, then we can claim the property held by the custodian of alien property, which was created by the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1917. Bureau of Public Debt to hold public debt created by everybody's franchise, alien property. Holding the property, the land, the substance that we can claim as reversionary interests that have been created off of the estate as profits and proceeds since we were presumed to be and pronounced dead and lost at sea on the Sea of Commerce at the age of 7. And then at the age of 16, 18, something like that, we volunteered to be the registered agent to receive service of process in the form of paper delivered, because we're the surety that stands as the liability holder or the trustee for the trust created every time a piece of paper is generated by the merchants of law or the law merchant.
At the age of 18, can someone opt out?
Pardon?
At the age of 18, can somebody opt out?
Well, yeah. He asked at the age of 18, can somebody opt out? At the age of 88, somebody can opt out. That's the bottom line. Well, then it would be the parents. Okay, but the parents have to do it first. Remember when you get on an airplane, they say if we start going down and the oxygen comes down, save yourself first. Okay, you got to do yourself first, and then it would be easy enough to do the children under the age of majority. We never achieved the age of majority because we are continuing to operate as a ward of the state, as a bankrupt, as the surety, and all the rest of it. And only an attorney, and when you represent yourself, you're acting as your own attorney, and of course, as your own attorney, you have an idiot as a client, because only attorneys can only represent idiots, imbeciles, and incompetents. Okay, so when you accept the contract of the attorney, the bar license letter mark and reprisal carrying Esquire, captain of the ship of state, you are voluntarily confessing to be an idiot, an incompetent, and an imbecile. Time to take a break. The jester is signaling me, so.
Real quick, how much of this is applicable in the gemstone stuff? How much of this is applicable globally, or what might that look like?
Okay, the questions, I'll just repeat the question. How much of this is applicable within Gemstone and Pantera and globally as well? And we'll start answering that when we come back.